So thanks for coming again. Thanks for spending the time here to listen to talk on SBOM. I'm Manoj. I'm managing security and engineering at an ML startup called Predigal. I've been in this space. I'm in this space for about last 3 years now, since executive order on using SBOMs to give transparency into supply chain, software supply chain. So again, before we go into disclaimer, it's my opinion. All the talks, it's not. So just make sure you research before you do any of the action items I propose. So the one thing after coming into RSA as a security personnel and an assurance governance and assurance personnel is that one was reassuring. One, like me, other professionals are worried about liability, worried about software supply chain, and also worried about how AI is going to impact our software supply chain, right? So my thought here is to kind of break it down and kind of provide a mental model of how to think about software supply chain and providing transparency into software supply chain. And do you need to provide software supply chains transparency to our customers? What are the trends which are in the industry which is actually pushing you towards giving you more transparency? I'm trying to shed some more lights there so that you see that trend is moving towards more transparency into the software supply chain, at the same time more transparency into the data provenance. That said, we all understand how our SDLC works. If you're a software shop, it's a mix of our SDLC controls. As a governance team, we put out some controls. So the software team follows certain SDLC, follows the SDLC principles. They use the third-party dependencies and build out a software, right? And to provide transparency, there needs to be incentives. So it is essentially, for me, legal compliance. That's one of the big incentives for us to provide transparency. In order to provide transparency, there needs to be standards on how to comply with it, and who are the parties who are impacted by it, and the tools you need to use to generate or provide transparency, right? All right, so if I can kind of summarize the trends we have seen in providing software supply chain transparency so far, the first thing we do in providing transparency is to provide accountability. So how do you provide transparency and accountability? We provide the terms of use, the license, and the privacy statement. The terms of use is the rights you give to the user, and the license is kind of the accountability on the software provider in saying, okay, this is what you get into. And the privacy statement is the data rights you're providing to the customer. And based on those terms of use, license, and privacy statements, you are on the hook for providing vulnerabilities or patches. And in order for the customer to trust you, you provide transparency on the trust, and the way you provide trust, the transparency on trust, is certifications. We go through SOC certifications, HITRUST, and multiple ISO and certifications to provide transparency to customers in saying, hey, you can trust the software we provide and start using it. That I would say is the current version of providing transparency. And what I'm hearing more and more is that that form of transparency is not enough. The customers are demanding more, and the governments are demanding more. So what I see is that more the trend towards attacking the software supply chain to exploit. And one of the keynote speaker referred to that as a new trend, which is 40% of our attacks are now through exploits on the software, no more social engineering. So what it means is that there's an increased trend or reduced cost for an attacker to go through our supply chain and attack our supply chain than social engineer us, right? So what it means is that the amount of transparency we provide on our software today is just not enough for the customers, for our customers to secure their software. At the same time, for us to secure our infrastructure, the current form of transparency is not enough. So in the current form of transparency, there's no regulations. There's the transparency is regulated by the individuals. As a software provider, I decide whether I want to provide our customer with what I'm doing in my SDLC, or fine-grained details into my SDLC. I do provide my customers into a definition of what I do, but I don't provide a standard way of saying, okay, I'm like essentially my whole SDLC written in a standard format. So there's no standards for it. So again, we do have tools and stakeholders doing the same thing, but in terms of like the framework, the way we have to think about the existing transparency is, how do you assign accountability, how do you assign trust, and how do you assign liability, right? So the accountability is assigned through the terms of use, license and privacy policy. Trust is assigned through either certifications, or if you're in special devices or critical infrastructure, you're certified by a government body. And the liability is essentially private, right? This is the existing form of accountability, trust, and liability, and how the transparency works today, and how the industry is moving towards 2.0, where there is more legal framework on how you should establish that transparency, right? There is a requirement from a legal side, or from the regulation side, to provide SBOM, provide a visual for every customer of your product into the ingredients which go into your product. When I mean ingredients, I'm meaning the libraries which you use, or the build, or also the processes you use to build the product, right? So what do I mean by 2.0 is essentially codifying all these artifacts, including your licenses, including your ingredients, and including your dependencies into the SBOM, right? And also giving full transparency into what are the vulnerabilities coming along with it, so that you can, what it enables you is, to quantify your risk, right? So once you know the ingredients of the software and the vulnerabilities associated with the software, you're essentially giving a means for the customer to quantify risk, right? And what the accountability, trust, and liability matrix doesn't change, but the liability, the one thing which I want to highlight is that the liability is being codified today in the legal framework. It's moving from the private individual contracts into a legal framework, where our governments are providing a legal framework on how to assign liability to a software, right? And the transparency framework is allowing them to say that through the SBOM, through the vulnerability exchange formats, you can actually quantify what a vulnerability or what is the risk you're taking, and what is the remediation or the SLA you're getting into. If we can achieve 2.0, there is more we can do with SBOM and VEX. That's what I call 3.0. So the software dependencies, we don't really need to adhere to just tracking software dependencies. Today, through AI, there is an explosion of interest in AI. It also means there's an explosion of attack surface. As a governance and a security assurance person, it actually creates more problems for us. So what it also means is that there's interest in tracking what those new attack surfaces are. And SBOMs and what like essentially VEX formats can help us track those attack surfaces, essentially give us a better inventory of those attack surfaces. What do I mean by that? So we can codify our infrastructure, we can codify our data infrastructure. By doing that, we are able to have an inventory of our data infrastructure, which is going into our AI software, which is what is the future. So once we have the codified format of data infrastructure, the software infrastructure, and our software itself, we can then scale the way we establish controls. Today, the controls we establish are very manual in nature. So by codifying our artifacts, the artifacts we generate, the artifacts we consume, the data we consume, we can push the control execution or control implementation into, we can automate the control implementation. So that said, what is incentivizing this trend? What is incentivizing moving towards an SBOM? Why do we need to do SBOM? Essentially, the regulations. There was an executive order in 21 May from the U.S. executive branch to provide SBOMs and the vulnerability information for a software whenever you're dealing with a federal government, right? So that is a trend in United States. There is after the 21 executive order, there came a FDA and Medical Devices Act in 22, which required SBOM and vulnerability exchange. In addition to that, you'll also have to track end-of-life information with end-of-life information for the software you provide on medical devices. So what I'm trying to say here is that there is regulations pushing us as software providers to provide more transparency into what ingredients we are giving in the software, what are the vulnerabilities which are associated with it, and what is the life cycle of that software. If it is going into a critical infrastructure, in this case medical devices, and if you are supplying for the critical infrastructure, in which is Department of Defense or the Homeland Security or Department of Energy. Right? So any of the federal government, if you're handling them, so you need to have SBOM in place and be able to provide some form of vulnerability management, which is already there. It's just that how do you provide it in a transparent and a standard manner, right? With that, I also want to kind of say that what is increasingly also becoming a trend is that our digital infrastructure is being considered as critical as a physical infrastructure. So what do I mean by that? Our digital infrastructure, our software, the SaaS platforms which enable the commerce in this country is also being treated more like the roads and the utilities which enable everyday comfort for us, right? So it's as important, the digital infrastructure is as important for the country as the physical infrastructure, right? So to kind of reinforce that, EU is also following up. So Germany had its own way of providing transparency to the software, which was the German IT Security Act. Finland had its own, and after that EU has come along and created a Cyber Resiliency Act, and essentially forcing or enforcing the idea that we need to provide transparency when you create a software product or an IoT product. You need to be able to say what is the ingredients of your product, what is the vulnerability which I'm coming with, and also give an idea of what is the life cycle of the product, right? Australia is also doing it. In the period between I submitted the talk and now, Singapore has started talking about transparency in the cyber resiliency, right? So cyber resiliency is a common theme across all the governments, and digital infrastructure being as critical as physical infrastructure is also another common theme. And how do they start providing it is by starting to push for transparency in the software development process. That is one of the key points I want to push through this. So if at the end of the day, if one thing you want to take out of the talk, you would want to at least take that digital infrastructure is as critical as our physical infrastructure, and one of the ways they are imposing that criticality is to push for more transparency, right? And what these all regulations mean is that it incentivizes us to be more transparent. How does it incentivize that? All the transparency information which was in the private domain, where in the case of a B2B, it's essentially a private contract, was enforced through a private contract, now is in the public domain. So you are required by regulation to provide these transparency information. It's no longer an optional where it's a customer to customer option, or it's now required if you are a software producer. And it's a legal framework. It also provides a deterministic way of finding liability, right? So you are able to provide accountability by providing this transparency. So how do you enable providing this transparency? The way to enable it is providing standards on how to provide this information. So how do I represent the ingredients of a software today? So the ingredients of the software today can be represented in formats like OWASP, OpenSSF, SPDX, and CycloneDX. And SWID. SWID is not essentially a language to represent, but it's included in the NEST standards at this point. So in order to represent the ingredients of a software, so when I say ingredients of the software, what are the components of the software you're using? So what are the libraries you're using? What is the build system you're using? In order to represent that, these are the standards you can use. CycloneDX, SPDX. And in order to represent vulnerabilities in your software, so when you are including dependencies, and if the dependencies come along with certain vulnerabilities after you release it, how do you represent that information? That is called VEX, Vulnerability Exchange. CycloneDX has a VEX profile. OpenVEX is another format from OpenSSF. You'll see a standard theme again. These are OWASP and OpenSSF are the two standard bodies or standard creation bodies in the SBOM field, which is popular. So I'll be referring to their formats. And how do I? So once I represent the ingredients of the software, how do I represent the SDLC or the maturity in my SDLC? Right? So the way you do it is using one of these formats. There's a format called InToto, supported by OpenSSF, and CycloneDX again has a way of representing your SDLC maturity. And there are maturity models defined by different corporates and also by NIST. NIST has SSDF. Then SALSA is something which is essentially a scorecard on how mature your SDLC is. And S2CTF is another framework provided by Microsoft. Again, OpenSSF, these are all supported formats within OpenSSF. So what does adhering to standards and providing more transparency mean for GRC? So as an assurance person, what do I get? Between the time I submitted my talk and today, my team has created about 20 new repos and 5 different products. And what it has meant for me is a lot of catch up as an assurance person. As an assurance person, what I'm trying to do is my team following the SDLC practices? Is my software secure? In order to answer those questions, I need to constantly keep track of this. If I'm doing it manually, which is the current way of doing it, it kind of burns my team, kind of being in this catch-up mode all the time, right? So, and the 2.0, or providing transparency through SBOMs and having them automatically being generated in your SDLC gives you a way of having an inventory of all the things happening in your organization at any point of time, right? So it gives you a high fidelity inventory of all the things in your software. At the same time, all the things happening in your SDLC. That's the way I see how one can get the best use of GRC, even if we are not incentivized by regulations. If you're not a healthcare or a health medical device provider, if you're not working with the Department of Defense or any federal agencies, even if you're just working with commercial providers, one of the best benefits of moving towards SBOM and the attestation or all the transparency exchange formats is that you get a better fidelity inventory of your software and the software dependencies, right? And that reduces the burn on your team. At the same time, it reduces the time you take to respond to any incidents, right? For a security team, again, one of the common theme is your inventory is in high fidelity. By having a high fidelity inventory, you can respond better. You can target mitigations. The implementation of policy is going to be better, right? So your implementation of policy can be automated. That's the key part, right? So what are the tools? So this is a key part. One of the discussions we were having before this talk is the tools are not yet mature, which I agree with. What my thought is to highlight some of the tools in the market for you to go and explore and be able to start your investigation on SBOMs, right? So the first tool you would want to consider is how do you generate these SBOMs? How do you integrate these SBOMs into your SDLC, right? So there's open and commercial tools. I'm kind of walking through the slides, so you can refer to the slides, and I'll also share the slides at the end of the talk. So there are enough generation tools. So one of the key questions is, okay, how do I generate? So how do I generate the different parts? For example, you can use CDXGen. I'm going to be, you can refer to other tools in the slides. You can use CDXGen to create your SBOM. You can use CDXGen to create what is called attestations. When I say attestations, what do I mean by that is you give information in a machine-readable format about your SDLC. What was my build process? Did I have a GitHub pull request? Did I have a secure environment for build? Did I have a test environment after my build? Did I test? Did I run static analysis? All those can be represented in the form of attestations. So at the end of it, you want non-repudiation. So essentially, you want to associate the information which has been given to a specific person. You want accountability and non-repudiability. That is given by a digital signing process. OpenSSF provides you what is called a SIG store, which will let you sign these standard documents or the documents you create using CDXGen or the OpenSSF tools. And CDXGen itself has a signing tool which you can use. How do you distribute these? Currently, the mode of distribution for these languages is using the artifacts repository, just the way you would distribute your executables and your libraries and packages. You would use the same to distribute these documents, these signed documents, right? What happens to OSS then? Like, we have a huge OSS dependency. What happens to OSS? So there are services which are coming along, which are trying to bridge the gap. As an OSS developer, if you're an OSS contributor, you don't have to worry about. But there are services which will take your package, build it in a secure environment, and provide an assured service which will say, these are the dependencies, this is the SBOM. At the same time, this is it gives you a service on top of the OSS package, which will give you the SBOM and ability to track the vulnerabilities, right? And how do you manage it? So now that I have a collection, I have hundreds of SBOM dependencies. Now, how do I quantify my risk, which is going into my software, or how do I let my customer know how to manage it, right? So The way you do it, in OWASP, we have built a tool called Dependency Tracker, and it will consume all the SBOMs and build you a beautiful graph of what is all your dependencies, and through which you can visualize where is the risk coming from, and if you can mitigate it or not, right? And there are industry-driven tools as well. So is this enough for you to adapt to the tool? No, because there are still gaps on how do you make the best use of SBOMs. So when I say how do I impose a policy on somebody saying that if you are not building in a secure environment, this package will not be released, right? So that kind of policy codification is not possible today because the tools are not yet ready. Okay, so those are some of the opportunities which are left, and tools. There's still tools, not the maturity of the tools not ready yet, right? So even though I say the maturity of the tools are not there yet, you can still kind of start small, because we are moving towards the trend of more transparency, and the SBOM is in and the VEX, or the vulnerability exchange, is here to stay, right? And the way you start is small. Try to identify one critical component you want to add SBOM to. Add SBOM first, and then add attestation, and then add vulnerability exchange, and then add end-of-life cycle information. So that will give you one cycle of essentially executing how to integrate SBOM, and you can redefine. So like I kind of had the same lecture for my students in Western Washington. One of the ways I tend to describe SBOMs is it is not doing anything different than your existing vulnerability management. It's just kind of having an alternative way of doing the same thing. It gives you more ways to automate your existing vulnerability management, at the same time enforcing policies, right? So you, as a GRC or as a governance person, one thing you can see this as a viable alternative for imposing policies on your SDLC and also managing vulnerabilities, right? That's it for my talk. With that, if you have questions, please do come to the mic. I'll try to repeat the question so that it's audible.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. If you could look into your crystal ball, if we magically get to 3.0, what would policy as code look like?
So policy as code very tactically would look like, it would look like something like if you have known OPA, so Open Policy Agent. So it's essentially, once you codify all your infrastructure and your dependencies, you now have an ability to enforce on top of it using essentially logical programming, right? And how do you add that logical programming layer? That is one of the ways to do it is OPA. So that's how I see it. That's the natural progression. So natural progression towards more automation. So the first part is providing transparency. You get a beautiful visualization of all the things which is happening in your SDLC. Now, once you have a visualization of all the things happening in your SDLC, I can now say, okay, turn this on, turn this off. Now I need to, instead of doing that manually, going to the team and saying, okay, turn this on, or make your build environment more secure. Now I just push a policy document, which just gets into their build machine and stops either at the build process or at their output process, where it says, now you haven't followed the certain build policies which I asked you to. Your SBOM says that, so I'm not going to let you release. And that is the eventual goal. And how you are able to gate it, one of the ways is OPA, which I was referring to. But there are several ways to do it. Yeah, thank you.
So is there a risk of having the transparency data out there?
Yes, that's awesome. So I was in the OWASP talk or OWASP workshop yesterday, and there was a similar question. The amount of exposure you want to or amount of transparency you want to provide to the customer is your choice. So, for example, in case of executive order, there's a minimum set of elements you need to provide to the government. So that minimum set of element still is a customization you can work with your customer, right? So you can work with your customer to figure out what is the level of transparency they want within the SBOM. You don't have to provide the same. You don't have to provide all the information which you generate internally to your customer. You can filter that out in order for you to address that risk which you're talking about. Do I want to give out all my build configurations to my customer? No, right? But you do want, as a GRC person, security assurance person inside your team, to know what is happening in your organization. So SBOMs will give you that visibility, but as a governance, you can decide whether this is worth sending to the customer and taking the risk or not.
Hi, any thoughts on accuracy of SBOM? If you think about a development process and your teams use like SCA tools to identify what they've brought in, those SCA tools, of course, are not perfect. So they misidentify a library version, and with no ill intent, the SBOM has inaccurate data in it. Have you heard like discussion about, just that nature within something that's then going to become potentially illegal, or a regulatory item, the SBOM. But if the SBOM is inaccurate through just tool fault, be curious, any thoughts? And
so I would rephrase that to be, wouldn't that, I would rephrase that to say that wouldn't that actually increase the accountability on the tool? So giving the false state through SBOM actually increases the transparency on where that false statement comes from. Which is how I see the value of SBOM, in that you have created a pipeline where now you have full log of chain of events for you to say what has happened, which tool has given you the statement, why it has landed in SBOM. Right? Now you have the accountability. Given that you can go back and create the chain of, you have created the chain of log, now you can go back and set the accountability to the tool maker, right? So now the liability is shifted towards the person who actually gave the statement instead of you, and that is okay for me, as far as SBOMs are concerned.
Hi, Cassie Crossley, Schneider Electric. I have about 4,000 SBOMs we've generated, so I can help a bit on this one. So from SCA tools, the confidence rating is from about 15% to about 85% for most of what's generated out of the SCA tools. Yep. The lower ones are ones that are firmware that are pretty old and have copy paste of libraries instead of any kind of package management or anything of that nature, and commercial. So the SCA tools can identify like .NET libraries, but if you purchase libraries from some company, it may not recognize those. Also, if you've backported any security patches, it'll just identify a version. Or if there are similar versions, like very little changes between certain things, it's not going to do it. So I have seen quite a number. So for those, especially when we need to have high fidelity and quality, we have our dev teams check that and verify it, and that's why I'm able to determine the quality, factor. Those built from the CI/CD pipeline, we still see, with Yocto and other ones, errors, but then we just correct it during the when it actually generates it.
The continuing point here is, because of the SBOM, you get the transparency on it,
yes,
and you are able to either reduce trust on a tool or work around it.
Yes, and we definitely work with the SCA vendors to let them know the false positives and negatives, so that they're improving their tools also.
Thank you.